Good afternoon. I'd like to announce Michael Menisa talk. Michael Menisa is known for various ways through his foundation. Of course, he's a board member of the KFA, the Foundation America, and he has his own profit, a non-profit organization which is dealing with early childhood education. He's also a filmmaker. Those who know The Challenge of Change have seen that movie. He's also very much involved in making sure that everything around Krishnamurti is being documented on film, has been interviewing people in the second generation, people who work with Kane. And today he's going to give a talk on you are not who you think you are. Thank you.
There's so many memories being in this room. It goes way back. I first showed up in Ojai in the mid-70s.
I don't think the mic is working.
The mic is not working.
Well, turn up the volume, is that better? Much better? Okay, so we'll talk right into it together. So anyway, being in the building, I filmed Kay here in this room for the Challenge of Change. We did a series in this room called The Nature of the Mind. Rupert Sheldrake was here, and so on and so on and so on. So the energy and the presence of this space is palpable. It's real. It's, you know, I always walk into it and it's like a breath of fresh air. Somehow coming around these places, you know, some of the worries and anxieties and roof chatter that goes on in our brains seems to subside a little bit, and maybe it's just a conditioned thing, but I don't think so. It happens so regularly, so it's really nice to be here. Let's see, I want to apologize because I'm actually not feeling on my top of my game. I'm physically not quite where I want to be, so if I go a little slow and if I sit down, if I, you know, so just forgive me because I'm just not quite up to it, but it's the topic, "You Are Not Who You Think You Are," is one of my favorite subjects. I've been, you know, actually Kay kind of started it years and years ago when he talked about the image. He said the image that you have of another, you know, if that's what you're relating to, then you really don't have a relationship. And you have an image and that person has an image, and most of our relationships is image to image, and you miss the whole thing. And I was dyslexic as a child and am still to some extent. So imagery became kind of a safe area. Spelling was not a safe area, but imagery was. As you see, these are my images. This is how I express what I do. The book Flowering was just recently done as a collection of kind of stunning beauty. Kay often talked about how beauty, when you encounter it, stuns you, and you're quiet for a minute, and you know there's something other there that the beauty does. So these images are, in some respects, intended to be somewhat stunning. That's why they're so big and so on, is to quiet you for a moment and just have the beauty carry you away. So that was all inspired by his work as well. The area where I got very interested in this theme, "You Are Not Who You Think You Are," there's a friend and a colleague. His name is Keith Buzzell. And Keith is one of the senior Gurdjieff teachers. He's a physician. He's been traveling and looking at the nature of the brain for many, many, many years. And Gurdjieff, well before Paul MacLean, who was quite famous for articulating the triune nature of the brain, the three basic core brains that we have, Gurdjieff talked about that man was a three-brained being well before MacLean did, and Keith was kind of taken by that, and he actually went, based on the inspiration from the Gurdjieff work, he went and met with Paul MacLean and spent a great deal of time trying to understand what this meant, to have three brains. Actually, we have probably more than that. And I've been friends with Keith for 25 years probably. And we sat down one day and he described this idea of the three brains, the triune nature of the brain. He said, literally billions of years ago, when the first single brain, what we call the sensory motor brain, began to develop, and it's the brain that we use that gives us our sight and our sound and our sense of the world. We get to see the world, we hear it, we touch it, all those sensations, the sensory or sensation brain. He said, one of the characteristics that makes a brain, and I've never heard this before, and I've talked with neuroscientists about it, and this is really not discussed very much, is that brains create images. Now, the kidney, we don't think creates images. The kidney doesn't create an image, or the lungs don't create images. So you have other organs, but brains create images. And so he said, well, what is an image? The brain is sensitive to a particular slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. So the sensory motor brain is sensitive to a particular slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. And that brain, through its sensors, through the sensations that we have in our body, in our skin, in our eyes, and our ears, and so on, those sensations come in to the system, and then the brain actually constructs, builds our perception of the world. We are not seeing the world like a camera does. There's a lens, and the light kind of crosses over and projects an image on the back of the film. That's somewhat what we think is going on, but nay. Actually what's going on is the brain is constructing the images that you see and feel and touch, and that we essentially call reality. Now, reality for a cat is going to be different than reality for an alligator. Their brain is actually going to construct a different kind of image. So the images that the brain produces is relative to the organism. And anyway, that idea. So I really want you to get this idea of what he called the brain creating a resonant representation of that slice of the spectrum that brain is sensitive to. Okay, so he said, now the sensory motor brain, or what's called the reptilian brain in Paul MacLean's vernacular, the triune brain, the reptilian brain is this old brain. We have that brain. And then millions of years, he's nodding like he knows all this stuff. So millions of years later, growing out of or nested in that sensory motor brain, evolved a different brain to overcome the limitations and the constraints of the sensory motor brain. One of my dear friends and colleagues and mentors, his name's Joseph Chilton Pearce. Joe's written 10 different books on human development. And Joe's talking, one of his books was called The Biology of Transcendence. And the meaning of transcendence is to transcend means to overcome limitation and constraint. And his proposal is that the whole thrust of life is to overcome limitation and constraint. So it builds a structure. That structure is, meets the world and develops a certain relationship to the world, and then it settles in, and then by golly, we have to overcome the limitations and constraints of that plateau and bust through the concrete of those limitations and evolve another structure that transcends those limitations. Okay? So then, millions of years later, the brain evolved what we call the mammalian brain. Mammals appears. And the mammalian brain is, and this is how Keith described it, he said, the sensory motor brain gives you all these sensors on your body to measure what's going on outside, give you a resonant representation of what's going on outside. We have an image. Now, the lizard who has that has a rudimentary sense of self, because that reality that brain is producing is almost synonymous with a sense of proprioceptive self, if I could use that term, right? So it has it. But when the mammalian brain grew, what it did is it literally evolved sensors, spindles, a whole sensory network that monitors inside. So the mammalian brain looks inside and gives you a resonant representation, generates images. This is the hard one, the tricky one, because the mammalian brain gives you images of what's going on inside as you relate to the outside. And we call those images feelings. But they're images. Feelings are a resonant representation of how you are relating to whatever this moment is. Does that make sense? But it's an image, feeling. So you have sensory motor brain giving you an image of what's going on outside, and that corresponds to a quality of self-image. And then you add to that, now you've got you've just doubled your universe, because now you, instead of just one brain, you have two. So now you have, shall we say, a two-dimensional sense of self, because you're not only aware and have an image of who you are as you relate to the world in a sensory way, you also know how you feel or how you're relating to that. So now you have a lot more information, and that actually doubles the complexity and richness of your image of yourself. You follow that? Next, and millions and millions and millions of years later, the neocortex comes along, and that particular brain takes its information from the previous two, and it abstracts an image. It abstracts a symbolic and metaphoric image from the data that comes in from the other two primary systems. And again, this is somewhat comic book in what I'm trying to say, but I just want you to get this idea that now you have these three brains. They're all feeding data in, and all of them are creating images. So when we talk about who do you think you are, you're not who you think you are. Well, the key words in that are think, who you think, or what you think. What you think is really this the neocortex. It's the symbolic and metaphoric brain generating these images. That's who we think we are, is an abstraction from the data that comes out from those other two. So the idea, then when you, if I can shift back into K, I'm going to walk out on a plank and suggest that the dominant focus of Krishnamurti's insight, his core insight, had to do with the images that are produced by the neocortex, what we call thinking. He talked about thought, a lot about thought. But when you really start listening carefully to what he was really talking about, and I read some quotes and so on, he was talking about when you see an eagle fly. Do you see that with your intellect, which is, I know what an eagle is, and it has a certain shape of wing, and it eats certain things. So you have your memory and your ideation or ideas about what that eagle is. Or do you just see the eagle fly? And he's differentiating between the neocortex, meaning the thinks, the thought, and the memories, and so on, and the actual experience, sensory motor experience of the bird flying. And he said he didn't have any problem with direct perception of the bird flying. He did take exception with the memory and the conditioning that we have from a neocortex standpoint, interfering, getting in between, standing in between. So a great deal of what I believe he's really talking about has to do with the neocortex and not necessarily the limbic system, which is the mammalian brain, or the sensory motor brain. And he actually made that distinction quite clear in the talk that he was doing. So the big question for me is, what is the nature and the structure of this image of self-image? We all know that we all have a self-image. We assume that that's the case. We don't have self-image. What is the self-image, the image of self that we have, and how do we get it? This, to me, is drilling right down to the core of the heart of the matter. Well, in some of my work with this little nonprofit called Touch the Future, I had the opportunity to travel and to meet with a lot of developmentalists, people who are looking at the earliest stages of development, how those, there was Paul talked about Piaget. There's a whole bunch of information out there today about child development. And I'm going to say about a decade ago, a man named Alan Shore, he's a neuroscientist, I think out of UCLA, wrote a book called Affect Regulation and the Origins of Self. And it was a massive, massive document. It had over 1,200 citations, page after page after page of research citations. extremely well documented. And his primary focus was the transition from the in-arms period, which you probably know is when the baby, before the baby, the brain develops in such a way that the baby can get on its 2 feet into the toddler. So you have a transition from in-arms to toddler. We call it the terrible twos. Well, it's not the terrible twos for the kid, but it is terrible for us. Because why? What is the toddler doing that it wasn't doing before? Getting up. What is it?
Getting around.
Getting around. Chasing the cat. Knocking over the vase that grandma brought. Right? So now the kid is driven by the world, driven by its nature to explore the world through all of its senses, to touch and to taste and to feel and to, you know, what again Piaget called build a structure of knowledge of the world. So it can relate, and it does that through play. So everything that the child does is an active play, which is, if we want to be erudite about it, we're going to call it inquiry. But it's play. Play is the act of learning. Play is the state in which learning takes place. So the child is out there starting to explore the world, and what do we do that we never did before? What?
Restrict them.
We restrict them. How do we restrict them? We say what?
No.
But they're still going after the vase. What do we say? We say no! We ratchet up the no with intensity until they're startled out of their entrained interaction with the world, right? So what are we doing? What are we doing to that brain in that instant?
You're conditioning.
Limiting.
Go deeper, yeah, all of that.
Brainwashing.
Sorry?
Fear.
All right, so fear. So basically, here's the deal. I'm this little kid. There's the vase. I'd never seen it before. Granny gave it to us. She just brought it from some wonderful place. And this baby goes, man, I'm going to go see what this is. And it goes after it. And then I say no.
If there's something wrong here.
But we are enforcing the authority there.
All of the above. But in the psyche of this baby, right, it's driven to interact. And now you, who are supposed to be the safe place, you are home, you are safety, you're nurturing, you're like protection. But what happened to you when you started to scream no? What happened to your safety? You're no longer safe, right? You became
Afraid.
the source of fear, right? So now every no that you say becomes a threat, is seen or perceived by this kid who's just going after the vase, just like the cat or the pond or the fish or the paper or the hot dog or whatever else it's doing. It's just doing what it's supposed to do. And safety, nurturing, in arms, suddenly becomes the threat. Now, what happens to that baby's, the state of that baby's brain?
Fear. Confused.
Well, Paul talked, somebody said fragmentation before. Entrainment, total entrainment, which was the state of play to go after and explore the world, just got shattered, right? Because threat came in, and the baby's just trying to go forward and do what it's supposed to do, and at the same time it has to look over its shoulder and cover its ass, protect itself. From you, who used to be safe, but now you're the threat. Okay? So this entrainment, this complete attention that Kay talked about, the baby had until we fracture it with our use of no as a threat at this critical period when the brain has grown and it's now moving around to explore the world, and every no, and the statistics are 11 no's to any, yes, darling, chase the cat, right? So 11 times threatening to any kind of positive. This baby is the smartest organism in the known universe that we know of. how long do you think it takes for that baby to predict that the next time it reaches for something, somebody's going to say no? Not very long, right? And what are they going to do when they do that?
Test.
Well, their brain is now fragmented, right? This fragmentation, this split of attention has occurred because they're anticipating somebody's going to yell at them if they go after the fish in the bowl or whatever it is, right? So they inhibit themselves. You see that? They're going to self-inhibit. This threat becomes a pattern that they predict, and then they self-inhibit based on that. Now, what I want you to just hold now is this one little thing that has happened in this 18-month period. Alan Shore really nailed. I mean, he really said this was such a critical period that all development that follows is predicated on what takes place at this very vulnerable time. Now, you can say that about any stage of development, but this is so early that it becomes fundamental or basic. So now you have a reflex, a fear reflex, right? So that anytime you're going to go out there and explore the world and sing or dance or paint or whatever you're supposed to do in this playful expression of who you are, you self-censor and you begin to think, well, are they going to like me? Are they going to tell me no? Are they going to approve of me? Do you see how this works? Now, build that up. Consider that to be the grain of sand that's embedded in your psyche at 18 months, around which the pearl, or the grapefruit that we call the self-image, blossoms. That make sense? You see that? Let's go just a little deeper. What is the root of the no? Where is the no coming from? It comes from basically the outer culture, right? The culture predefines what is okay and what isn't okay. And the parents are basically mirroring the outer culture, right? So that, you know, we don't pee on the floor, or we wear clothes, or we do it this way and not that way. So all of these kinds of things are really, all the no's and all the prohibitions are basically to inculcate in the brain and the psyche of that child the outer culture.
All the notes?
I'm going to say the use of no. You can model how to relate to the world, how to pick up a knife, how to do anything. You can model how to cross the street without threatening the child with a no, right? So, of course, there is the meaning behind it that, you know, it's not safe to do this. But my point is that the use of no is a threatening, intense experience that fragments the consciousness of the child. And around this, which is a mirror of the outward culture, we develop our own self-image. Our image of self is really a mirror of what's approved of or not in the culture. This relationship between image of self and outer culture, I've been kind of messing around with for a long time, but it dawned on me recently that as a structure, there's no difference between culture and self-image. Self-image is, by and large, culture, the rights and the wrongs of culture. That's what the image is that we eventually say is my self-image. This is who I am. to me, this is a really big deal. Because we have to do business with not only self as image, we have to do correspondingly business with culture as image. They're the same thing. They're structurally, they're not different. They're two sides of the same coin. They're two ways of looking at the same thing. Self and culture are simply points of view, not structurally any different. It's one thing. Do you follow that?
Yes. Would you say micro and macro?
Sorry? I'm going to say embodied or personal and macro. I would go so far as to say culture, and this is kind of interesting too, but culture is a meta-ego. When you start thinking about what culture is, it's all images. Culture is basically images. The rights and the wrongs and ta-da-da. Does that make sense? Culture is really a collage of images of how we think it should be done. So culture out there, now let's bring it back home to Kay a little bit. Kay's insight into the image-making nature of the neocortex struck through both image of self and culture. When he says nationalism, what is he talking about? He's talking about the images that we have about being an American, excuse me, or an Indian, or whatever it is, right? So he's basically saying, you are not the image either of self or of culture. He's doing both. And this is where I think it drops right down to the hub of the matter, is that culture and self images are basically one structure looked at from two different ways. They're inculcated or impressed on the brain very early, way before the kid has any chance to discriminate. It's assuming that whatever the adult is doing is wise and sane and correct. And I would venture to say that, in the hunter-gatherer period, when life was much less complicated, that was probably true. That the adult was modeling a relationship to nature instead of modeling a relationship to an abstraction that we call a Republican or a Buddhist, right? Those are way up. Those are abstractions. Those are neocortex images, not this other. So when we realize that the image that we're carrying is a reflex, and the reflex was embedded in us out of fear, out of defense, then we wake up and we realize that the whole structure of that image of self is really a defensive reflex. In the state of play, in what is termed the optimum state, in optimum states of learning and performance, athletes call it the zone, researchers call it flow. In this optimum state, there is 100% attention given to the moment. All of your attention is given to the moment. This is Csikszentmihalyi's definition in flow. He said one of the things that he got from all his research was that when the athlete or the performer was in this state of optimum performance, there was no fragmentation. There was no energy left over to look back and see how you're doing as you're doing. This is a classic definition of child's play. This is exactly the state that the brain was originally in until it got fragmented by threatening it to conform to cultural images. Any questions so far?
But in spite of the fact that the culture, it applies to, let's say, the entire nation. The culture in the US may be different than let's say Pakistan. And the culture different in each family or community. And yet, there's so many different individuals within this small unit. Two individuals are completely different from each other.
I would agree that two individuals are different.
What is the other factor that is not accounted for that causes different personality?
Well, I think different personalities try to wiggle around the limitations imposed by culture in different ways. That's what I was saying.
Philosophy is different. Democrats and Republicans, we completely see, they don't see eye to eye.
Yeah, but they're reactive to patterns of thinking that were developed when they were young kids by the initial no. Is my opinion.
So I'll just tell you a personal story, and I don't know whether it'll be helpful or not, but again, I mentioned that I was in the slow group when I was in school, right? I was in the dumbbell group because I had trouble with reading. So language skills came slow to me, and therefore I was a slow learner. Well, it was so hard for me that I built up a tremendous fear of Fridays, because Fridays was spelling bees. We had a spelling bee on Friday. And I knew on Monday morning that Friday was going to be a spelling bee. And that at some point, I was going to have to stand up and spell a word wrong and be the first guy to sit in. And I just, every day as it inched closer to Friday, I dreaded it more and more. I would go home at lunch, walk home with tears pouring down my face and say, "Don't send me back there." And Mom would turn me around and, push me back there. So I understand this really deep conditioning. And it took a long time. I couldn't even read a birthday card in public, right? Because of this fear reflex, which was my self-image on display publicly, right? And so on and so forth. And it really took a long time, but it was really an insight into the image that freed me from worrying about it anymore. I had to free myself from the limitations and constraints of the image that had been put in there and all the fear reflexes and so on, so that I could just go out and talk to people or do whatever I wanted to do without worrying about how the culture was going to come back. When we say we're not who we think we are, what I'd like to explore just a little bit now is, what are we really? Right? If we are the most intelligent organism that we know of, and culture, by and large, is out there is conservative, it's to limit and constrain our behavior to conform to the accepted norm. That's what culture's role is to get us to be like culture. And it can only do that by narrowing, by restricting. So how do we begin if we're holding on to this image, if the image is active, then, again, as Kay said, your image to image, everything is preconditioned, it's secondhand, et cetera, and it's all based on the image, which translates into our identity. So what I'm going to suggest is,
I just wanted to balance that. You talk about the no's, but the yeses are doing the same thing, right?
yes, yeses are doing the same thing, right? Yep. Alfie Cohen wrote a book called Punishments by Rewards, which is a brilliant work which addresses the reinforcement side, the rewards that do the same inhibiting. My real question is, how do we liberate ourselves from who we think we are? How do we free ourselves? Realizing now, if you ask yourself, how many things haven't you done in your life that you really would have loved to do except you didn't because you were afraid that somebody would laugh at you? right? You didn't ask the girl to dance that you really thought was beautiful. You didn't ski the slope, or you didn't do, or you didn't sing, or you didn't. How much of your life didn't you experience and express because you were afraid of that your image might be exposed, or whatever you want to say? Have you ever been embarrassed? Have anybody ever been embarrassed? Why? Why? Why would you be embarrassed? What is embarrassment? Why would you ever be embarrassed? What's at risk? It's just the image, isn't it? We've identified with it. Our identity is there. Our identity is with that image. And as long as that image is active, we're like walking around with balls and chains, literally. It limits our learning, it limits our expression, it limits every aspect of who we are, how we relate, what's okay, what isn't. We self-censor ourselves to death because of this image. Well, the brain naturally creates images, so now we've got a process going on of creating images, but because we don't realize it's an image, we reify it and treat it as though it were real, but it's actually just an image. This was Bohm's whole thing about images. Okay? So as long as we treat the image as though it were a real thing, pardon the expression, we're screwed. Right? Right? We are not free. Kay talked about freedom. So the only way that you can be free, the first step in becoming free, is seeing through the false hopes and false fears attributed to this image, identity. And I'm going to suggest to you that when you do that, when you see that the rope isn't the snake, and you're the snake, right? When you see that, now you've seen, you had an insight into the false nature or the image nature of the image. And I think this is at the core of Kay's teachings. And let's go there for just a second. So Kay said truth is a pathless land. We've all heard that. What's a path? Psychologically.
Predefined way. It's the image.
It's an image, isn't it? Yes, it is. But first, at a primary level, the path is a mental construct. It's an image. Kay is saying in this one phrase, truth, or whatever that means, is not an image. Path being an image. Truth is not an image, he's saying. So he says man cannot come to it, meaning truth, through any organization, any creed, through any dogma, priest, ritual, philosophical knowledge, psychological technique. What are all of those? They're all images, aren't they? So truth, or this thing that we are, this great, huge miracle that we are, is not an image. And any image that we create about this stuff is obviously not it. You can't do it, so it's not an image. And that includes dogmas, rituals, philosophies, analysis, right? You can't get to who we really are by creating an image about it and then somehow trying to get over that. Anyway, it's all about image, in my view. Here he goes. Man has built in himself images as a fence of security. Here's the baby, remember? Has built in himself a fence to protect against the baby being threatened by the no. Anyway, he goes on and on and on. As I went through the core of the teachings, in my view, a full 80% of this was Kay denying the role of the neocortex image. So a long time ago, David Bohm was alive and well. And where were we? I forget where we were. Oh, I know, we were up at the other office that we had over here. And I did a little interview with David. And I asked him, I said, David, why is this self business so hard? Why is it so hard for us to see this self as an image? And then to do anything about it. Why? Why? Because obviously this has been something that has surfaced. Kay wasn't the first person to do that by any means. And I brought to you, we'll spend about 15 minutes listening to Bohm describe what this image business is. And over the years, nobody that I've ever come across has done such a great job of describing why it's so tricky to get through that image. Okay? And now all we have to do is figure this out. Anybody know? Eric, are you here, or shall I just push? Shall I pretend I'm 12 and push all the buttons? That's one.
We won't say no, Michael.
I'm sorry?
We won't say no, go right hand.
No, I got one, but wait till it turns blue. Here it comes.
There's a light up.